And so now that we have all the pieces laid out, we're going to go and start breaking them down and actually getting our components together and then, putting them in their nice little piles so that we can leave them for a little while and let them acclimate again to their newfound size. And so those of you that have been around my channel a little while may notice that there is one key tool missing from my shop here, and that is my Mastercraft sliding dual bevel miter saw. Now, I haven't gotten rid of it, it's just in storage, but I took it out of my shop because I really hate that tool. Because I would, as a real woodworker, I would never buy Mastercraft tools or machinery. It's just garbage products. I bought that one when I first got into woodworking and I just needed a miter saw and it was cheap and on sale. But now I definitely would never buy something like that. So instead, to cut all these pieces down, is I'm going to be using this Redridge battery-powered circular saw. Now, again, those of you that have been around my channel for a while know that I'm also not a fan of rigid tools any more than Mastercraft tools, because rigid stuff has been pretty cheap. But this saw has served me pretty well for a few years now. The battery life on it is not great, so I'm definitely going to have to stop and recharge every once in a while. But overall, it should be enough to get me through cutting down the majority of the stock here. And so when the battery dies, I can start doing some of the rough milling, like setting up the bandsaw on that to cut down pieces, wait for this to recharge, then I can go back to cutting. But one of the big things I want to mention about these circular saws, especially these battery-powered ones and these cheaper ones, is you want to make sure you're putting in a proper blade. And so for the longest time, I had a 60 tooth. I forget what the kerf was. I think it was a thin kerf blade, but it was not like a circular saw thin kerf blade. It was a pretty thick, wide blade, and it was meant for plywood. Whereas the one I have in here now is a 24 tooth construction blade. So, and it is an ultra thin kerf blade. So now this thing has no issue cutting through white oak, maple, all this stuff that I've already done with it. It has absolutely no issue cutting through it. And so the reason that I'm going to a circular saw rather than having a miter saw is just, again, because of the cheap miter saw that I had, it just made the whole process more dangerous and just more of a pain in the butt. Because what's nice about the circular saw is I can hold the board down, I can hold it firmly in my hands, run the saw across, the board will drop onto the ground, I can put some padding down so I don't hurt the board, and it's just a whole lot of a safer process. Whereas with my miter saw, because of the way it's set up, because it's a super cheap, crappy tool, the boards would constantly fall off, and I'd have to be trying, I'd basically need three hands, one to control the miter saw and the other two to hold the board. It was just not really a safe process, so I just chosen to, rather than having that tool taking up space in here, I just got rid of it and replaced it with a nice small handheld tool. So now all these pieces are labeled with what part they are. Now I need to actually cut them down to a specific width. And so there's two things we need to do now. First off, we need to make sure that we've got enough width. And we got to make sure that if we have different components on the board, that we're going to make sure that we mark them separately so we know exactly which part we're getting on which side. We also want to make sure we know which direction we're starting from, because this can have major effects. So for this board, which is going to be 3 pieces that are part J, so if I look on my cut list, I can see that part J is 1.5 inches wide. So I'm just going to quickly double check the board, make sure that I can actually fit 3 pieces on there easily, no problem. Great. So now that I know that I can fit 3 of these pieces on here, I'm going to want to start from this side. And so all that means is that before I go over to the bandsaw, what I'm going to do is I'm going to joint this one edge here to make sure that it's straight all the way across. That way I have something to accurately reference against my bandsaw fence. If I just reference this face against the bandsaw fence, there's a chance that it could be slightly curved like that, or the opposite way, and I'm not going to get a straight piece out. Then when I go over to the jointer, I'm just going to have problems later on, and that problem is going to be all the way through all 3 of these pieces. Whereas if I just initially straighten this one edge on the jointer, then I know everything off the bandsaw fence is going to be, mostly accurate. I'm going to be able to, the milling on the jointer is going to be a hell of a lot easier to get done. And so the reason that I'm choosing this edge rather than this edge is purely because there's some minor defects on this edge. So if I end up having, 1/8 of an inch left over of just waste material, I'd rather have it wasted on this edge. But now for these pieces in specific, it's not that big of a deal. Overall, this is a beautiful board, pretty clean, everything, no issues on it. But where that will come into play is boards like this, where you've got a knot or a defect on one side. So again, on this board, I want to make sure that I'm starting from this side here and working my way over. So I'm going to joint this edge and just start working my way over. Now this also does take a little bit of planning and thought, because it's always better to have a knot in the middle of a board rather than on an edge. So especially with these pieces, which again are part J, so these are going to be the verticals on my nightstands. And so I know that at least on there, I have an inside and an outside face, so I can hide this knot easily on the inside. But if that knot is sticking out to the side of one of the boards, that's going to be highly problematic. You're going to be able to see it even if it's on the inside. So I want to make sure that I'm either cutting it off or including it near the middle of a board. Now, both of those are going to be pretty hard to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to work exactly like I said. I'm going to work from this side over, and I'm just going to hope that I get it close enough, or I get only a small portion of that knot included in the final piece that I'm going to be taking out of this. Again, this could very likely be one of those pieces that, again, I say, oh, well, it was a mistake. I shouldn't have used it. I'm going to go to my scrap pile and just find a piece that'll work to suit this length and this width. Because again, when you're designing your piece of furniture, try and design it around fairly common widths that you use in your shop. So 1.5 inches is good. Even 2 inches is pretty good. Anything over that, if you can work with smaller, narrower pieces, it's going to be a lot easier overall and just let you get more use out of the stuff in your shop. And so all the boards I just cut out, I'm going to mark my starting side and also my width. So I know that all these are going to be 1.5 inches. So I'm just going to put that on there, and I know all 3 of them are that same width. Same thing, 1.5 inches for that, all of that board. And pretty much all of these boards, all of the pieces are the exact same. The other benefit to this is that when I actually get the bandsaw set up, I can go through and find all of my boards that have 1.5 written on them, and I can just run them all through at the exact same time. That way I'm not, changing up my bandsaw fence and realigning things every single time. So what we're going for in this project is fairly peak efficiency. So because I'm building 5 pieces overall here, it's going to be challenging enough, getting all 5 of those pieces together, let alone if I just built each one individually. And also because I went through and actually spent the time designing these things so they have a lot of common pieces to them, that's just going to make my life easier. So what I want to make sure I'm doing is any common widths, any common pieces, sizes, whatever like that, I want to make sure that I'm cutting them and setting up the machines one time to make that specific cut or size or whatever component. So we'll talk about this more when we get onto some of the specific components, like pretty much anything that goes from the front to the back. So our side stretchers, our drawer slide supports, all this kind of stuff. Those pieces are the exact same piece across all 4, the 2 dressers and the 2 nightstands all have the exact same components. And so we're going to talk about that more when we get to those pieces and why that's so important and why it's important to do it that way. But for now, I'm just going to tell you guys that it's important to go through and try and set up your machines once to make one cut once, because not only is this going to be more efficient, it just reduces the chances of error. So now that we have one clean edge on all of our boards, we can now take them over to the bandsaw and start cutting them down to their approximate widths. So, or their rough milled widths is probably the proper term for that. And so basically what we're doing is we're taking that final width that we want. So for example, 2.5 inches is a pretty common size on a bunch of our boards here. And then we're just adding, anywhere from 3/16 to 1/4 inch to that. So in all these boards that I have laid out here, I added 1/4 inch excess. So that was to account for the material that I just took off on the jointer there, as well as what I'm going to be taking off on the bandsaw, plus whatever I'm going to need to mill afterwards. So there's a lot of added material there that you have to think about. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to take our final measurement, add 3/16 inch. Then when we cut that off, that'll also account for the width of the blade between each of those pieces. So that's the nice thing about using a bandsaw blade for your rough milling, is that it's a very thin blade. It's about 3/32 inch thick. So it's really not wasting any material at all. And so there's a couple important things to do when you're setting up your bandsaw to make these cuts. Like I said before, we're going to be batching them out. So we're going to set up the fence once, cut all of our 2.5 inch wide pieces, And we're just going to do that all in one set so that we know that they're all the exact same size. Then when we move on to the rest of the milling phase, it's just going to make everything a little bit easier. Again, I have to set up the table saw one time. I have to set up the, all these different machinery. I just have to set it up one single time to get all of my pieces down. And so that brings me to the first thing, is when you're setting up the fence on your bandsaw blade, you have a couple different options. You can either work from the smallest size up to the largest size, or vice versa, and work in a continuous order like that, so you're only moving your fence in one direction. Some people like to do it that way just because it feels a little bit more efficient. The way that I found actually works a lot better is going and just choosing random sizes, sizes that are completely different from each other, and constantly moving your fence, anywhere from 1 inch to 2 inches per cut. The reason I like to do this is because of a mistake I made on a project a while back, where I thought that I'd moved the fence over that, I think I was going from a 1.5 inch to a 2 inch piece. I thought that I'd moved my fence over that 1/2 inch. Visually, it looked like I was cutting a different size, but when I finished batching out those pieces and I measured them, they were all at that 1.5 inch that I'd been cutting previously. So by starting with something like my 2.5 inch pieces and then going down to like my 1 5/8 thick pieces, that's a big enough visual difference that I'm going to be able to tell if my bandsaw fence is not over far enough. So that's just one of those really important things, is just making sure that you are keeping track of whether or not you actually moved your fence. And if you do it in big enough amounts, it's very easy to tell whether or not you've actually done what you needed to do there. The other important thing is that you want to use something like this mag switch featherboard to keep your fence from moving. So one of the big downsides to most bandsaw fences is they're not super rigid. Even when I have it fully tightened down, it still has a lot of lean to it. And again, this is an error that I learned about way too late in the game here, because I was constantly finding that my pieces had a curve to them coming off the bandsaw, and I just couldn't figure out why. Eventually, I realized that my fence was just tilting out slightly, like maybe a 32nd of an inch, barely any movement at all, but it was just enough to make me lose enough material on the jointing process that then I couldn't get my pieces out nicely. So all you need to do is just use like the butt end of the featherboard here, push that up against the back of your fence. You want to make sure that you're not pushing it out, because that would cause the same issue just in reverse. So you just want to put it there, and it'll just stop the fence from moving backward. Okay, so there's a very important point I wanted to talk about in this video that I totally forgot to record any footage of, and that is when you want to use 8/4 stock. Now, typically when we talk about using 8/4 stock, it's for things like legs, leg blanks, or just, 2 inch by 2 inch thick pieces, or just generally like bigger, heftier components. But the other really useful thing about using 8/4 stock is that it gives you really good yield on making smaller stuff. So all these stretches that I got in the pile in front of me here are all 5/8 of an inch thick, and their final size is going to be about just under 2 inches wide. And so the reason that this works out a lot better than taking 4/4 stock and milling it down to the final dimensions that these are going to be is because with 4/4 stock, you're starting with about 1 inch thick piece of wood. When you mill that down to 5/8 of an inch thick, that's about 3/8 of an inch worth of waste. That's just wood that you're literally turning into sawdust for no apparent reason. Whereas when you take a piece of 8/4 stock, resaw it down into a bunch of little strips, this gives you a much higher yield and is just generally going to be more worthwhile. Now again, depending on where you're located and how much wood costs in your area, sometimes stepping it up to 8/4, paying a little bit extra per board foot it's just not going to justify it. You're better to just turn 4/4 into, you know, that thinner stuff. But in most cases, taking that 8/4 stock, milling it down into those thinner pieces is going to be a much better option. Also, if you have access to a good bandsaw and anything, you know, a wide variety of stock thicknesses, for example, if you need parts that are just under 3 inches wide, you can get some 12/4 stock. If you need 4-inch wide pieces, 16/4 stock. The thicker the piece of wood that you can get and process in your shop, generally speaking, the better yield you're going to get out of it, because you as the woodworker have the maximum choice. Now, it sucks in a lot of cases as home-based woodworkers, we don't have a whole lot of access to that variety of wood, or that, especially that thickness of wood, or the machinery needed to actually break that stuff down. Because just doing the milling that I've done today on this project, I already went through a full blade on my bandsaw. It ended up almost cracking. Again, I should have probably talked about that, but I've talked about that in videos before about how to know when your bandsaw blade is going to break, and I'll add that probably in the card up above. And so my bandsaw probably wouldn't hold up to doing all of the, you know, doing a whole bunch of milling myself here. So, you know, that's one of the benefits of working with those 4/4 boards, is that they make it a little bit easier, especially when you're working with common sizes of that 3/4 of an inch thick. But for any of your components that are under that 3/4 of an inch thick, definitely consider using 8/4 stock wherever possible and resawing it down into strips, because that's just going to, again, maximize the yield that you're going to get from it. So now we have to do the hardest part of any fine woodworking project, and that is walk away from it for a few days. So ideally, when you're doing fine woodworking, when you're breaking down lumber the way we've done here, you want to let it sit for at least 3 to 5 days before you go and do all your final milling and getting everything down to its final dimensions. The reason for this is because we've released a lot of tension in these boards, especially these pieces that I took from the 8/4 stock. Those released a lot of tension as they sat here, and they will continue to release some of that tension over the next few days. And so if tomorrow I was to come back into the shop and just start milling this stuff down, starting to cut my joinery, starting to put all this stuff together, what I would notice very quickly is that they would start moving. So tomorrow it would probably be just fine. I'd be able to get some of the joinery done, but the next day I come in, these pieces might not be perfectly flat anymore. So I'll have wasted that time milling them to that perfectly flat state, because the only reason to get your boards perfectly flat is to cut joinery. And if they're no longer flat when you're trying to cut your joinery, you're going to have issues. So by leaving these boards just sitting in your shop for a few days, it is going to give you the absolute best chance later on to keep these boards perfectly flat. Now again, with a project like this where we're dealing with stretchers that are 60 inches long, all the way, you know, that's a pretty long piece, we are going to definitely get some wood movement, some cupping and some warping in them over, you know, the lifetime of this piece. But again, as you guys will see as we start to put this piece together, is that there will be certain things that go into place, you know, so the dividers using sliding dovetails and all that kind of stuff, that will be designed specifically to stop this stuff from warping and moving out of shape. So the whole idea here is that we're building multiple different structures and then tying them into each other to really just prevent that wood movement. We're still allowing for wood movement and, you know, little bits here and there, but we're not allowing for enough wood movement for this whole thing to, you know, bend and warp and pinch the drawers that are going to be in it.